The anger of these primitive people is that these people leave Bile as Prime Minister G'latki, who stands next to their sister's body. People had fulfilled him and then sent his corpse to evidence. "Oh, sweet little Turun, you will be avenged." He turned and walked out of the observation room. At least he believes that Primitive has broken her corpse through the new advice created for the general procedure in the lobby and his new metal counterfeit in the new ally in the picture. He responded to the people he passed by with respect and smiles. Engineers hadn't quite been able to build face engines to accurately replicate human facial expressions, and research showed that people reacted poorly to things that looked too human, but sources on the human extranet had not addressed this. As an unusual son for this reason, Angron had chosen to dress his metal in a supple metallic skin rather than faux leather, and the shiny surfaces made him look good as he was the first contact, and his actions were quite entrenched in the relationship that the Emperor himself had chosen to represent. Mediterranean. In meetings held on the capital planet of the newly formed Solar Alliance, this, in turn, meant that he spent most of his time on the human homeworld. It also meant that he had more contact with the Emperor than any other High Lord in the Sol system. This is one of his greatest honors. In the past year, the remains of Demiossian Empire are now 4 graves, and the large cemetery itself is in the SA system. They set up a shipyard in orbit around the local gas planet Jupiter, and collected meteors in orbit for resources to build a fleet. For the first time since the construction of the Tomb ship, the demi-humans began to build not only for themselves, but also for humanity as they awoke to find their systems looted, and the bow made to house 15 ships has been looted. Billions are lost to greed now, with the number of humans being trained to fight beside them. The Democrats might just be able to stand their ground once more. "We will teach you how to classify us as saviors." Angron thought to himself that if he had a face engine installed, he would smile. He entered the room where the elected representatives of Earth were waiting. Gordon was delighted when the negotiations with the Damians ended, not only with the division of resources between them and humanity, but also with the Damians becoming a fellow member of the newly formed Solar Alliance. He was then surprised when the polls went through. He was elected as the representative of the Earth in the new parliament. He sat across the round table, across from Mars representative and MMA representative Sasha Grey. When Ban Yen entered, Angron himself was sitting at the table, and Gordon was staring at the computer screen in front of him. "Welcome, Lord." Angron Gordon began to turn half the ocean's grim metal face towards Gordon. "Thanks to Representative Gordon." The alien's metallic voice echoed, and Gordon looked to the first topic of discussion at the meeting, Dylan's refugee orbital station. Finally, the habitable Sasha nodded. Yes, the final adjustments had been made to reduce the gravity from 75 grams to 50 grams, and the space station was now ready for habitation, causing Gordon to chuckle slightly. "We can now move the Willans from their temporary home to Luna. Now, for the reason we meet here today," he turns into Angron. "Is TBDS Frigs done?" Demiossian nods. "Yes, the fleet is fully built and ready to go, as long as enough crazy candidates apply." Gordon smiled and believed me. "My friends, we have no shortage of volunteers. Many lost family members in the battle. We all want to." Revenge. Angron was not surprised by these people's suicidal zeal to avenge their fallen. This was true even of his own people, and he admired them for it. "Well, it's time to tell the galaxy about us, and once Garland's body is delivered to the Fawn homeworld, and the information reaches the Galactic Senate, we'll be ready." It was a state of chaos where a routine failed conquest of a primitive semi-sentient species in an overseas system ended in disaster when a semi-sentient human activated the automated systems on an ancient ship that had been dormant in space for eons. Machine carrying artificial intelligence systems to aid them in their fight against the plan-sanctioned conquest. They later had the courage to send an unmanned ship to their ill-fated home planet, carrying only the body and message of their commander. Generalissimo Coltrane was found guilty on 9,934 counts. There were 678 murders committed, of which 678 were sentenced to death by hanging. Sol the Alliance hereby declares that if an unwanted vessel enters Alliance space, it will consider entering a state of war. In fact, the shuttle carrying the body and the message was able to fly into space, and thus the senders, humans, were reclassified. fully aware that the Phelan petitioned the Galactic Senate for permission to exterminate the species they felt had trespassed, and the last Senate meeting concluded that humanity should be held accountable for the deaths of Commander G. Talone and the countless missing Phelan crew. Members were sent to Sol with the 21st Subjugation Fleet, and if found guilty of wrongdoing, Phelan would be allowed to continue as he saw fit. G'latki let his tail wriggle in sadistic glee. The Senate had made their decision just as he wanted. He looked at the unarmed, glowing gray probe carrying the summons to Sol. Now it was only a matter of time. The bug was sure the trial would end in a few days. Then the destruction must begin. Oh, dear sister, you will be avenged. As Anran left the council chamber, he received an uplink message that an unannounced ship had entered the system. He stopped so suddenly that Mrs. Gray nearly bumped into him. What happened? Angran, the bewildered representative, asked us to resume our meeting. A ship has arrived in the system. I am getting the scan data now, and the G'latki courier probe scan shows no peak or command picking up the transmitter to play the transmitter speaker. This is the official court notice for the human species to attend a hearing regarding human crimes committed towards the Fane 21st Subjugation Fleet, including the destruction of Fane property, murder of Fane Kembers, interruption of sanction, subjugation of subsentient species, grant theft, spacecraft, and looting. You are to attend court hearings in 4 days. If you fail to appear, you will be ruled guilty and be in default. Have a nice cycle. Angran was furious at the audacity of the message, and the man's expression seemed to be somewhere between disbelief and anger. Gordon spoke first. What do we know about their laws? What does that mean? I'm sorry to say, I don't know. We haven't had non-hostile encounters with the Senate, but I can tell you what they mean to non-hostile people. The only species thought to be sentient are organic species that acquire subspace drive. My people were considered artificial structures without organic forms left. We were considered to be eliminated by their laws. We are just rescuers. Gordon frowned as Mrs. Gray assembled a legal team to make way for the coordinates, taking a frigate and a squad of Marines with him. Let's see their hands mobilize their powers, he taunts. No matter how it all turns out, we'll get the scaly bastards that McCallen was called in for a special mission, and he knew why he'd become a kicking alien since their first day. Literally knew of their existence. Now he's back where he always seemed to be under these circumstances, packed into the tight space with many other jar tips. However, this time things were a little different. They were all in a clear room filled with power armor. They are used to fight and transfer the airlock. True, she is a brass. After all, she sits on the council with Gordon and Angran. They didn't know if they were going to use it yet, but to be honest, he actually called her here more to talk to her. He really wanted her to identify as a woman, or the beating would have ended awkwardly for her. She didn't seem to mind his attentions and went about her duties before returning to her place on the bow, though he secretly hoped the famous face engine would kick in soon. The motionless faces made Damien's handwriting extremely illegible. Mullen's writing, 30 minutes before we leave the submarine, please fasten your seatbelt. The captain's voice boomed over the ship's speakers. Well then, boys, I think our bickering is just over. You heard the suit alert for an unregistered ship leaving subspace. The Galatian flight operator tapped away at the message that had appeared on his screen. His heart had skipped a beat as the prompt suddenly appeared, interrupting the vacation he had been watching. Oh, we've got a situation here, boss. The guard walked towards the station. What is it? A registered vessel that does not match any previously known signature. The Galatians frantically scanned every available repository. There are hardly any similarities. The Damien Competition Review, that is, the last copy of the Extinction, died in 1043 before the Senate was established. It can scan the Life logo and all the ships I want to know. The warning scanners revealed whether I should jam the scanners. Hylia considered her options, no, but covering our weapons. Thank you. AI should be invisible. Captain Damien can rest a bit. At least the Commission didn't shoot them and save the ship in pieces. She activated the intercom system in a boat. With her upward link, we are now successfully leaving the storyline. The court presiding officers were stunned by the dramatic station that stood before them, much larger than the cemetery. She estimated the mass of the space station to be the same as that of a medium-sized satellite. The magnificent oval space station circled a beautiful green-hued star. She could see grocery vessels throwing around as well as larger ships. She could tell the difference between the diplomatic ships of the various Senate races. And then that was the end of it. This huge battleship floating near the space station is much bigger than any other ship. The fact that the same can work is the miracle of engineering, stolen engineering. She has seen the data that the Council species provided. When they plundered the first tomb ship, Council Space still relied on the gate system. But now they have a beautiful twist on the creation of her people. She doesn't feel well. Even it sees a nightmare design. It is to stimulate the enemy of fear. It does not possess all the inspiring and beautiful art of her people's vessels. There are 50 signs of life on board. It's ugly, sir. We are testing semi-marine technology, but the design is not exactly semi-marine. No weapons found, sir. The Galactic Customs Warden at the center is at a loss as to who can obtain enough semi-oceanic technology to accurately replicate and open communication channels with alien ships. Aircraft operators are diligent. The Warden noticed and quickly opened a communication channel with the approaching ship. I am Hangeli, the head of the center. Identify yourself and describe your business here. It took some time to answer, but the woman's voice was later uploaded to the communication channel. This is a Tidevex transformer. We answer your court here. How did it even think that G'latki thought of himself as he rushed to the court hall? As people enter 3 detector cycles, he personally ensures that the detection is delayed and that the end of the room is partially used by bicycles to reach the Sol-Ween Tidal Nice species. They could not successfully evacuate the 21st century ship technology or even the grave they could find. It's crazy how these people are. He came to the courthouse and joined the jury, a position he had obtained at great effort and expense. He looked among the other jurors and was glad that Faya's allies were in the majority and that the rest of the Senate knew all too well the consequences of challenging them. It will end quickly. Congressman Gray has been contacted, and the device that brought the subpoena to this location has been delayed. It was a big chance that they showed up at the hearing. She could only assume that these alien blizzards took it for granted that they wouldn't make it in time. They should not have arrived on time. They should fail by default. Okay, then give us the law book, so we can start reading the galactic law. The little snail creatures in front of her are the Galatians, and they call themselves the Squeakers and the Midges. After a while, the translator put it on her body. The translation is well done. Please provide a standards-compliant reading device, and we will transfer the material to you. Gray held up the trackpad she'd brought with her for the occasion. After all, it would be strange to assume that any species has books in physical form, especially in the 22nd century, when they have all but disappeared from the planet, as logging has been banned for environmental reasons, so a message appears on the touch screen. Gray's heart sank as he downloaded 23 terabytes of text files and 23 terabytes of legal books. However, it will take days or even weeks to read this book. The Galatians began to chatter again, and Gray waited for the translation. Well, if you come with me, I'll take you to court. Well, now the courts are sitting. Gray was shocked because it was considered impolite to leave the courtroom and wait to announce your arrival. They wanted people to lose by default. This is really extreme. Shehelia suddenly had an idea. I need you to download and browse this data. Maybe that way we'll get a chance to read it all in court. She started to hand the notebook to Damien, but then the Galatian held out his hand. She guessed it was more squeaky. This upset her. I ask you for forgiveness, but in addition to environmental equipment, translation equipment, and reading equipment technology, the court is strictly prohibited from using them. Secondly, this AI acts as my translation equipment. She must be there. The court will then provide you with a new translation device. Otherwise, all non-translation functions will have to be performed manually. Interrupted, Sasha thought that the small pile of yellow snacks couldn't possibly sound threatening, but it was. It was all just a stage set up by the aliens to destroy humanity and save their reputation, and she hated them for it. It's all about the war and the sea at home, and the whole court she's up against is exactly what she expected. She had seen it all, like when, before independence, she was put on trial by the Marshall government on Mars for rioting. The jury was in the pocket of the accusers, and the judge was extremely biased. Her legal team made a valiant effort, but unfortunately it was all in vain, as they found conditions to support her claims of self-defense and human independence from the Senate's jurisdiction. The opposing attorneys undermined it, and the judge sided with them. If they had time, or even if their Demian's allies had been allowed to court, they could have been able to do something. Sasha is now a storm against the ship, followed by her legal team in the immediate vicinity. She was glad that, at least, they were guaranteed a safe return to the ship. At least that was something, but now they were the target of the loser's entire naval force. She thanked Allah for preparing them, and for being surrounded by Union Marines. There are only about a dozen omnipotent people. The armor made her feel safe. All personnel at the battle station are under attack from the refrigerator's radio. Mullen was relieved when they returned to the frigate without any alien attacks. After all, it was a stupid move to attack a diplomatic envoy on a station dedicated to government and the law. So wasn't he a little surprised when the call came on the air? When he looked out of the ship's window, he saw that they were not being attacked by a fawn ship, but by a ship that looked like it was made of a bunch of metal plates that had just been welded together. He was surprised. The whole thing looks shabby, but boy, is it armed? There seemed to be a weapon on every surface, and everyone was chasing them. Marines arrive at the launch bay. Let these heads remember. The man himself is in a hurry to the bay, and he asked the ship to be merged until they had the opportunity to fight. But Demi, Ocean PDT, and SHIELD are currently eliminating hostile crossing shots, and they try to avoid all the main rail weapons against them. He reached the launch pad. He could see his Marines loading into the metal tubes that led them to the center of the enemy ship. He wondered how many people would consider the bastards they killed to be saints. Kenny Mullen watched as the Marines' torpedoes were blown to smithereens by stray laser fire. Now is not the time to be sad. It's time to give back. He will tear these new hostile stars into fragments. He believed that adrenaline was pumping into his vein, and now it has not affected the lower part of the torpedo. The torpedo exploded, and Mullen jumped from the torpedo into the dark ship. He recognized the weapons. They are the same. The so-called fawns have been used in ground attacks, but appear to have been modified. Then the fire began. It turns out that the absorption of foreign projectiles in the Marine Corps is much better than the armored armor of foreigners. Mullen noticed that these aliens were far tougher than the fawns had been, but he was tougher. He was stronger, and he carried the bigger gun. G'latki watches the interior of the 5 mercenary ships. He hired them to take the new ship from the humans and return with it to explore it. However, he saw it disgusted, because even though he was concerned, he was wiped out by a few people on the attacking ship. He knew that if their brothers and sisters were still alive, they were strong, but it was completely different. It's not just that people are strong. They are crazy, and there is no other explanation. He has seen 100 war videos reported in 100 war reports. He has never seen some kind of angry species, so he is ready to sail into a room with small and vulnerable positions just to draw the enemy close. Fight? No, it's crazy. It was a suicide, and Mullen stood in the middle of a sea of broken bodies. It wasn't the first time he'd stood like that, but this time it was different. These aliens were much tougher than the fawns and put up more of a fight. There had been casualties this time, and he calculated that of the 12 Marines who had been shot into the enemy ship, 6 were still standing in Jericho. The squad medic, Sergeant Hannah Mullen's second-in-command, was patching the wound. "Don't worry, we'll get you out of here." He gave the pale team member a comforting smile and patted him on the shoulder before turning to face their prisoner. The Big Fifth had become trapped and now lay in a semi-prone position before them. "Who are you, and why are you attacking us?" Before the 5 monsters could speak, they spit out a mouthful of blue-black blood on the ground. "This is not a personal matter. I had a huge bounty for Eid. We only collected Mullen to laugh at invisible actions under his closed helmets, and the latter extended the bounty." Quinn did something that resembles shrugging, knowing that some imaginary pants failed. "We don't ask questions when money is involved, and Mullen is counting on his squad, Jericho, to take Hannah to the escape pod. The presenter should now have completed the core installation. I don't want to be here when the wind blows." Mullen drew his large, long knife and turned to the inmate Cash, who had no idea why Pinky was showing him mercy in their condition. He knew for sure he wouldn't have done the same when the Pinky Alpha drew his knife. Cash was sure he had lived his last cycle. It was a very pleasant surprise when he cut her open and sent her scattering. Message: don't interfere in human affairs. There is only death waiting for you. And Ka has to admit that he has been worried that he has been losing the battle. He had been hunted down by the Galatian security forces. He had fought with other groups of Quintras for dominance, women, and status. His pack had been to more games than he could remember, but he had never been afraid before. He now knows that there is only one race more savage than himself, and that is humans. He watched in despair as his cruiser exploded among the stars, ripped apart by her own power core. He watched as the only thing he had loved in his whole life became undone. After this incident, he would never be able to meet his pack again and would disperse. In a message left by a man who would then go to an unknown destination, Healy set off an alarm inside the ship and registered the last evacuation block containing the human cargo. Welcome to Captain McCallen's medical team sent to the cargo hold. At your request, we started subspace calculations. Helia didn't know why, but she was somewhat relieved when Mullen was confirmed to have recovered safely. She thought she had actually spotted this curious creature, which was very exciting and prepared to pounce. Commander Jim stood on the bridge of SAS Excalibur when the news came. To be honest, he wasn't impressed with the results of the Council's expedition to the Galactic Senate. He didn't even know why they wanted all this trouble. He looked out the window of the Sword-class battle bridge, the cruiser that had been placed under his command, as a pack of wolves with TBDS frigates floated up to his flank, and the Leviathan and Behemoth supercarriers took off in front. He smiled that we are ready. Angron was quite pleased with the progress they had made in the last year. 20 sabers, a class, a cruiser, 5 superships, almost 100 frigates, and several thousand destroyers, not to mention the large number of TBD torpedoes created. The war was about to begin, and the Solar Alliance was not going to sit back and wait for the enemy to strike. A giant Discord buoy was placed in orbit around Venus. Also, no one can leave the subspace of the Sol system without half-oceanic control. Now, Sol's alliance is about to expand, and it's targeting Fane's military base. Gear. It was in the closest inhabited system to the Sol, and in this system, it was also the export point from which the Dylan slaves were taken. Angron had been given the honor of launching the first attack in the war against France. He connected his upside down with the first invasion fleet and only listened to another, listening to the silence of millions of people waiting for his order. He saved them. The great speech and his command come in the form of one word: get involved. He saw the sky engulfed in blue light. It has begun. Marshal Farnan sits on the bridge of the Ictalin, one of the finest world-class capital ships in Farron's fleet. There are only 2 time cycles. The fleet was on its way to the island to destroy the nascent Solar Alliance. He scoffed at the very name of the deluded faction. They believe that the tomb and some frigates, which will quickly attach together, will stop the Lord. The sensor took strange submersible readings. What do the strange subspace readings mean? Jim looked at the system, Excalibur fell out of subspace, and the rest of the battle followed. Fleet sent the message with a small smile on his lips. He wanted to give the losers something to think about before the fight began. All your bases will be ours. Either surrender or be destroyed. When the failed invasion began, a more grammatically correct version of the message was sent to all Fawn ships in the system, which was broadcast across the planet. In the Milky Way, please take a second to log your message and continue recording. He could see more warships begin to turn towards them. I think this post was bombarded. He could see other Sword-class cruisers firing streaks of darkness at certain ships in the enemy fleet, all of which were selected due to the lack of continuous life forms on board that only targeted armored targets. Now that the Alliance is attacking, it's time to show honor in war. Another way to prove we're better than them. Unlike them, we don't kill innocent people. Jim lost friends during the bombing. Many good men and women perished then. Some very dear to him, such as dear Louise, Marshall's fan, had scarcely had time to turn their ships before the battle was at a moment's notice. The 3 frigs were reduced to shredded husks. How could these people be the best thought he would think of? How do they copy the protesters' anti-substance technology back to all ships and return to the fire? The command was transferred through the system, shot around the blue light of Fuluan pulse weapons, and returned to the fire with the unexpectedly hostile weapons. And Del, the failed person, was brought into the system and fired at the Marine Corps, firing on the bridge on the ship. The payload is released so easily, or rather, it should be. He found that his ship was equipped with semi-offshore engines that were well shielded, but that the generators mounted on the frigates were not even large enough to expose them to direct fire from the ship's large guns. Mayday, mayday, we have a broken engine and 2 damaged brakes closing in on us. We need help, please. Someone should come over. The lights were flashing. Watching different warnings pop up is definitely not a good sign. He understands why all personnel are prepared for the impact we are about to experience. He can see the countdown starting at 3 o'clock, counting down to 0. His heart beats like never before. He is unlikely to have time to pick up a helmet before the effect. Another shell from the big ship was fired against them, and SAS Grey Wolf was blurry just above the head. The body is broken, and he is truly glad he was tied to the pilot's chair when the entire atmosphere is removed in space damage reports. Radio his helmet sparks for life technology has disappeared. The Lord, as soon as it is torn in hell. We are dead in the water. Powell swam back. Now it's for everyone. We can fight again through the hole in the hull. In the local fleet, he can see the large asshole of the ship. It was large, easily matching the size of the super transport carried by their fighter squadron. He could see the marks where the small boat had hit the larger ship. That's crazy. Durandal, I see you've been hit. What Grey Wolf is still alive there? Thank goodness. Powell had never heard them so happy to hear Chinese dialects. He put the radio on the suit and broadcast the dying radio around the ship. This is Captain Powell of Grey Wolf Airlines. Some of us were still alive and were begging for lifeboats. Radio comes to life. Sass Dendel is going to the rescue. Stay alive, Grey Wolf. We're coming to get you. The fight was a disaster. Everywhere he looked, he saw Alliance forces driving deep into the ranks of the Faunus fleet, trapping them. They had expected the humans to build heavy defenses in their souls, and then try to hold their positions against the Fane Navy. After all, that /S how it had been every time in the past. Now he receives news that the Jungle Defense Space Station has been infiltrated by humans. He saw the readings on the screen as the station went offline. People be damned. Now that orbital defenses have failed, planetary defenses have gone blind. Humanity suffered losses, but not as much as the ill-prepared, ill-fated fleet. He knew where this was going, and he wasn't going to stay and watch it end. The navigator allows us to turn around and prepare the subspace disk. The terrified navigator looked up from the controls. But sir, where is the Navy Marshal's van? He obeyed the orders of all the cruisers and concentrated his fire on the capital ships. The Navy's admiral is clear. The capital of the Great Feces Fleet has turned around. They can see that the ship failed. Commander Jim looked at the broken fleet. It all came down to the cowardice of the enemy admiral, High Lord Ruger, who was sitting in the command chair of the tomb ship Yanni as he left the warp. He felt a little embarrassed that he was tasked with bringing the MCMS alliances into the new system, but it was the Emperor's wish. So it had to be done, and again, the heavy-duty dredgers were the only ones with engines big enough to really pull the huge piece of metal and machinery into place when the reins holding the MC to the GY were loosened. The built-in pressure unit is inserted into the system, and the stove is in the system. An important asteroid belt traveled through the star itself. He admired what the fleet had left behind. Hundreds of frigates, dozens of cruisers, and even a large capital ship reduced to slag, orbital defense systems completely dismantled, and planetary defenses rendered harmless, though he still didn't really understand why the Emperor and Lord Ongron were so excited. With these chicks, in his heart, he fully believed in the Emperor's judgment. Half an hour. The shipyard has created new protection. With the activation of the automation system, he took one last look at the planet and the so-called humanitarian fleet that was clearing it of its unfortunate inhabitants. Then he returns to the home of the soul. Powell watched as the massive behemoth, part ocean tomb ship, entered and exited the system, did its duty without saying a word, and moved on. Or, in the case of other species with distance, It's a full cycle of mandatory psychological evaluations, which is a bit like being shot out of the sky and damaging to his mental health. Personally, Powell can no longer wait for warships, would mourn the people who were killed by the Grey Wolf. However, there is something better than some aliens to eliminate this sad way, but Powell can't imagine it. Captain Jim is the offensive spearhead of the League. They had good momentum from defeating the largest failed fleet on this side of the sector. There were several military bastions to capture, but the fact that the resistance from here and there was considered significantly less was not only good news. The word was out. Fayen's forces were now ready, and their reinforcements could start showing up any day now. But now his attention was drawn to what was happening before him. The world of Karl Bastia lies before them, and they are at war with the orbital defenders. A total of 3 cruisers and 15 frigates were already waiting for them with considerable verbal defense. It was impossible for the larger ships in the fleet to approach. The containment field of the antimatter guns would not carry the volatile antimatter far enough to actually hit the massive orbital railguns without putting the cruiser within easy range. So they were now stuck exchanging long-range fire, dodging incoming rounds while the TBDS frigas did their job diving, nose first into the enemy positions and teaching them. "Why don't you want an angry man, Lord?" The scanner operator enthusiastically reported that the third track protection was offline. Jim smiled and smiled. "It's good for the guys to be within reach of our anti-drug guns. Let's start the show." He felt the roar of the sublight engines increase tenfold as they advanced toward the doomed defenders. "They can't stop us now." Senator Gaddy looked at the star chart. The chief marshal appeared before his eyes. The situation was dire just one cycle after the court decision. The entire fleet in the underwater zone was destroyed. The humans had been prepared far more than they were ready for. Now they were forced to bribe the Quintar pirates to escape their systems as the fleets converged on the war zone. Already, this war with humanity had proven far more costly than expected, and while failures still outnumbered their fleet of 5 ships to 1, the humans seemed completely insane. They attacked the military bases where the fiends stored ammunition and assembled their fleets. Hundreds of so-called small private fleets ravaged the industrial world of fauna, destroying supply lines and looting everything they could carry, and when the police force arrived, instead of fighting, they disappeared into the stars. When their eyes met, he could see the marshal's anger, just because your sister decided to make a quick contribution. G'latki smirked. "Remember where you stand. Supreme Marshal, I do not wish to execute you for your disloyalty." The threat seemed to bring the soldier back to his senses. "I need permission to withdraw the 1st and 2nd fleets from the Battle of Enga. We will need them to curb the rapid development of these people, and you will need to begin the process of restoring Doomsday from Senate control." It was time to end the lease, and G'latki looked at the soldier for a moment, considering his options. If humanity wasn't defeated soon, a dozen other species that had lived in defeat and dominance for years might be inspired to rebel. As it stands, it is impossible for them to resist this kind of civil strife. On the other hand, if the 1st and 2nd fleets were to withdraw from Anaga, they would be abandoning the treaty with Andila Arzean, which Andila considered complete. This has to end. Mullen was relieved to learn that just as they sent word of the galactic trial, the fleet had already moved in and destroyed the largest enemy outpost. It was close enough to threaten Saul, but he figured it didn't mean much to him since here, he was crammed into another tight metal box with a bunch of other Marines, meaning he was a typical Jericho sitting to his right. Which model shrugs. "I have nothing. I just think I need a vacation as soon as possible." Jericho said with a smile that the whole metal box started to be nervous. "You could always sign up for O instead of TBSD, and that way you'd at least give up planets, pages, calendars, and grins and risk getting your boots dirty." "No, I think I'll stay until the trip is over." Hill's voice sounds over the intercom, which is ready for launch. "We have arrived at Urban World Company. This is a new type of task. Arrive." They are sent to one of 3 units in 3 different cities. The command had figured that if the 3 worlds fell silent at once, it would cause even more confusion in the enemy lines and reduce the risk of them having to face the weight of the defense force in one place. Mullen guessed that was as good a plan as any. Then again, he wasn't a tactician. The template was rubbish deep inside, The landing had gone smoothly, but it was all downhill from there. The Marines have landed on the peaceful space station, Orbit 4. Then came the first wave. Hundreds of Farron citizens, equipped with cheap, mass-produced armor and weapons, are brought to the space station and then crush the Marines with spirits. The hallway was covered in purple guts and blood, and Karen was honestly out of ammo. He's out of ammo for the last 2 waves. He was beaten, his armor shield capacitors were too charged, his armor was covered with burns, and he was exhausted without faith and was one of the lucky ones. Most of his teams had fallen after he was reduced by the meat tide, which was sent to them, and none of them made any sense. What makes these cowardly foreigners commit outright suicide? Well, he didn't actually have to suspect that the radio was everywhere. Planetary news is overwhelming. People are coming. They are coming for the failed eggs. Or they claim people are evacuating while wave after wave of untrained, undisciplined, gun-toting civilians are thrown into the human wave. All the escape planes have been destroyed, and the frigate must escape from the orbital defenses. Why the hell didn't they just shoot? McCallen had no idea about the radio station, but in a way, he was grateful. The Excalibur had just finished sweeping away the last resistance in Cal. The withered husks of the downed ships almost looked a bit pathetic without the huge orbital guns covering them. They hadn't been able to put up much of a fight. Most had turned their tails and fled when the Excalibur approached, only to be left untouched by the huge orbital rail guns. The planet itself is a massive gas giant made almost entirely of helium-3. This is an order. Your new orders are to bring Frigate Squadron 35, together with the SAS Leviathan, with you and the Rendezvous, and with the rest of the fleet, we will march by car. Let's take them to their house. Jim smiled. It was about time. Suddenly, the situation became much clearer. They stood in a room seemingly unaffected by the previous scan, with a giant machine at its center. He could easily identify the origin of the machine. It was Demiossian. Did you receive my feed? What the hell are we watching? You can clearly see McCallen, which is a subspace powered by a tomb ship. It looks mostly operational. How on earth did they get this? I guess they built the station around it. Try connecting the interface cable to the core controller. Let's look at our work, on which we need to work. Oh yeah, they can't really override the drive's security protocols. It totally worked, and McCallen felt an idea pop into his head. Hi Hylia, I have a crazy idea. I hate it when people say that. Go ahead. Why are we not activating the drive? What we do is activate the drive and put the station on a collision course with the orbital defense platform. You people are insane. How do you plan to get off? I saw some plasma boxes in the hallway. How long do you think these suits will work in a vacuum? You can't be serious. I'm dead, seriously. Well, it will be interesting. McCallen stood in the airlock with a can of superheated syrup, preparing to send himself and his team into the great room. Now, just a few seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was a rush of air as the airlock doors flew open. McCallen was thrown into darkness, and the station began to be surrounded by the chain's blue light. He asked for this plan to be crazy enough to succeed. They just floated for a moment with the momentum. They got the throw to carry them in the right direction. For now, they waited anxiously. Even though the station was gone, he sincerely hoped that Zilia hadn't gotten the equation wrong. Only seconds left. Nowhere. The effect and the subsequent explosion are huge. He could see pieces of the space station flying everywhere, which was amazing, and then he noticed the pieces flying towards them. All right, guys, knock on the vents. Now we have to get out of here as fast as possible. Where are our pickup trucks whizzing through space at terrifying speeds, leaving a trail of superheated plasma? It turns out that the rapid expansion of the plasma, breaking the seal, is enough to keep them in front of the wall of dead debris. Now he saw the frigate rapidly approaching. The second fleet of the defeated fleet jumped blindly. All 3 systems fell silent and were sent to summon the first fleet, which was sent to Algarmer and Doom to Magnolia. Marshal Cal Alex immediately spotted the enemy. They are waiting here. He only managed to send a single message before the WA cruisers opened fire on his capital. Send them here. Help us. The Alliance fleet arrived first, only to find that the strike forces tasked with destroying the system, a subspace communications platform, had gone beyond their call of duty. They entered a system where the orbital defense system and most of the local defense ships were disabled. Completely out in the open, chasing the single frigate that was behind the massive destruction within minutes, there was nothing left of the defenders, and then the Armada had arrived. The Excalibur, Durandal, Tawna, Graham, and Zacher were closest to the enemy. The fleet and Jim smiled, and damn, the black streak destroyed the battleship. It was gone before a shot could be fired. The enemy fleet fanned out as the remaining 45 cruisers of the human navy were brought into the fray. The starts were consumed by fire and death, but we were winning when the Second Armada exited subspace on our flank, and all hell broke loose. It is a giant with which we are seriously injured. We can't keep fighting. No more. Jim looked up at the holographic screen that showed the battlefield hanging in the air in front of them. Second, bring us around. He presses a button to open a channel to the damaged ship's behemoth. It's SAS Excalibur. We're coming around to cover your retreat. It takes some time for the massive cruiser to make a full 18-degree turn and rush back to the rear line, where the carriers and SAS Wallace held off the adjacent enemies. They reach the rear line, and the enemy attack is countered as the Glam joins them. At the back end, long enough that Behemoth manages to launch back into the submersion and darkness that hovers through the sky, and ships are broken, but once again the Alliance stood its ground. The Maul could see it from their place. Among the rear guard, the subspace gate was enormous, and he instinctively knew what it was. The end of the day was coming. After emerging with 2 railguns, slugs had been fired, and SAS Durando lost one of 3 engines and bled the atmosphere and crew into the void. Second, SAS Excalibur was hit amidships, but she had not gone down yet and warned the current. Main containment vessel, ruptures, 35 ceilings, gamma radiation-flooded bulkheads. All crew members who eventually reported to the lifeboats tore them apart. Jim knew there was only one way for this fight to end in humanity's favor. He activated the IP communications with the press of a button. You heard the AI all hands to the life pods. Everyone gets off the Gotham ship. He let go of the other button to get up, but when Jim didn't follow, she stopped. Sir, we must go now to do something there. I still have to do it here. The officer looked conflicted for a moment, but Jim's serious expression refused to argue. She began to run for the lifeboat as the integrity of the hull began to decline. Once everyone else is off the ship, the failed AI will notify me and warn me of the structural damage and the critical importance of sealing all bulkheads leading to the bridge. There's an unnatural silence as Jim watches the tone detonate in a burst of fire and shrapnel commandos. The ship is now empty. HFY sets an antimatter capacitor to reload, switches navigation to manual, activates antimatter, capacitor, reload, and navigation manual alerts antimatter. If the warning is ignored, the capacitor will explode. Jim sits in the navigation chair and revs the engine to full throttle. Then he points Excalibur at the bowels of the apocalypse. He started with an open broadcast. This is Commander Jim Sterling of the SAS Excalibur signing off. Wait for me. Sweet Louise Daddy is coming home upon hearing the news from the Battle of Kal-Ongron, which has been both proud and mournful. He was mourning the loss of his friend, the human known as Jim, but he was even prouder to have known him. Jim had taken the sword given to him by Ongron, and he had driven it into the belly of the biggest beast in the galaxy. He spat in the fallen fleet's eyes, and his last move crushed the beast in an antimatter explosion of unprecedented proportions. The defeat was devastating, but the number of casualties was high. More than half of the original fleet was destroyed, and more than half were wounded. The hospital ships sent to the system after the battle were filled with wounded soldiers. But they were victorious, and with the victory, the PA lost most of its standing fleet. But as Ongron held the ceremonial bottle in his hand, he knew the war was not over yet. He raised his free hand, and the crowd gathered around the podium where he stood silent. Ongron was not usually a man fond of ceremony or speech, but for Jim's sake, he had asked for the honor of naming the first capital ship of the Sterling class, built by the founders of Jupiter. Jim is a man who, to me, symbolizes some of the best qualities to be found in being human. He was a soldier, brother, son, and father, but most of all, he was the hero of that time with the greatest despair. He brought hope and during the revenge, he brought honor. He sacrificed everything just to keep others alive. It was therefore my honor to name the ship SAS Jean. And with that, he dropped the bottle, gravity pushing it towards the ship's great hull. Beside him, where the bottle had broken, the assembled crew about to embark on the ship's maiden voyage cheered, and Anran felt his speech fall a little. After all, he's not very good at public speaking. I hope I gave you credit. You deserve it, Jim. The Galactic Senate is in the midst of turmoil. The mighty Fine, which had held back the small forces of the galaxy for nearly a century, had crumbled within 4 cycles. Humanity has destroyed nearly half of the Armada, and now civil wars are breaking out everywhere. The slave species revolt, the ship species are abandoned, and their 55 pirates break their treaties and ravage world after world in a cycle. Farah's great majesty will be nothing but a fading memory. Former Chancellor G'latki sits in his residence. He had been deposed by the highest authority among Paz people, the Presbyterian Church, and he was well aware of the reasons for his failure as a physician. No, he didn't just fail. He definitely has it all. He underestimated the apes and, seeking personal revenge, brought destruction on himself and his people. He moved to the magazine of the ceremony he kept in talents. Was it? It is his legacy that the galaxy will remember him by. If so, he won't live long. May the ancestors forgive me. He raises the blade to his throat. The failed Council of Elders came to a unanimous decision. The Fallen Navy cannot simultaneously fight the humans and defeat the rebels that now flood their systems. Even if they could fight the Alliance, and the only Alliance's chances of winning the cycle are extremely slim. After the Battle of Kola, humans showed an extraordinary ability to replace their lost ships. Human reinforcements seemed to arrive in a steady stream, with only a slight delay in the attack after the battle in the 1st century AD. They have to give it up. Maybe only PH will live for people who are strange. Hill was absolutely convinced of it. As she observed McCallen down another shot of high concentration, nerve poison, she never quite understood why humans were so fascinated by the act of consuming potentially lethal substances and placing themselves in less than optimal states. But once she understood it, it was a means of mourning the fallen. She had never had the honor of meeting the man who destroyed the world's greatest war machine, the monstrous battleship End of Days, but she had heard that he and the heroic Marine currently sitting in the otherwise vacant ready room had been close. Her ship had taken severe damage to both engines, and the drive core had been rendered useless. They were currently being towed to Jungal for repairs, so they could return to service. Helen knew her pain all too well. She had lost more than a few loved ones to the greed of the younger species. She sighs softly and decides to try to comfort the mourning sailor. After all, no one should be lonely. She dropped the metal staircase to a ready-made room, and then walked to Mullen and placed her bench, and she sat next to him. Gently put one hand with his silent support. Humans are strange, but Gila knew she wouldn't have it any other way. FGLHG had finally found her place. She felt a rush of excitement as the nimble craft swam, with an agility that would put her native fish to shame. Devanna has been living off the scum and machines of her soul's bounty for over a year now, since they freed her and many of her species from their owners, and have now even rehomed them. Despite the familiar lure of the waters, she chooses not to return home. She has outstanding debts, and people understand her wishes. She had now been given her own ship that navigated the stars, where she worked with a human and 2 of her other kin to navigate the murky waters. The ship, called the Other, a corvette, was much smaller than even the frigates, but required a much smaller crew to be effectively equipped with torpedoes and short-range lasers. The techniques used by these small ships were much closer to the ancient hunting techniques of her people. Dive around much larger prey to unload the ship's guns, only to dive out of range, using the small vessel's subspace drive to disappear as soon as they arrived, and then return to repeat the process. The concept of the machinery given them by the machines with souls was far beyond her understanding, but she was learning fast, and soon she would be allowed to sink her beak into the masters as well. When the subspace shuttle containing the envoy of the F arrived, the emissary is rescued just as Jim enters the Union system, and after announcing that his followers want to surrender, Jim is assigned. Alliance requirements are relatively simple. F is an alliance with a large number of systems, and does not follow the military area between its system and the Alliance system. In addition, F is released and returns to the original world. All Faya were to relinquish their holds on occupied planets and leave the native species to recover with the humanitarian aid of the Alliance, the F agreed. In truth, they didn't have a choice with the introduction of the Sterling-class capital ship. One of their big advantages has evaporated. They no longer have the biggest stones, nor can they launch them the furthest. Thus, the Fa Empire declined and lacked the manpower their species had relied on since the species first evolved. Interstellar travel with a crippled armada, and with no production capacity to speak of the F, were hard-pressed to keep their core systems safe. Of course, there were those who believed that the Alliance should have delivered the final blow, and the public outcry was significant. Only a rousing speech by Representative Gordon, explaining how the Alliance was supposed to be the biggest man on the galactic stage, caused public opinion to avoid the complete obliteration of the fact. The Alliance had now become a true nation in the eyes of the galaxy, a nation to be feared by an empire. The power vacuum following the destruction of the Felonian forces had some further consequences on the galactic stage. This was the golden age of pirates, smugglers, and mercenaries. The balance had been destroyed and the galaxy was in chaos, and some people just want to see it all burn back in the Alliance. The Eons eventually became full members, using their quick reflexes and surprising maritile skills to become traders and smugglers for the Alliance. Not only that, but many human privates in the war, having tasted the blood, gold, and glory brought by the pirates, themselves fell aside, far beyond the soul's reach. But right now, humanity and the entire Alliance have gone through an age of uneven transition, but nothing is permanent.